Recognize Representative Rosencrantz to present House Bill 1007.
Clerk will read.
House Bill 1007 by Rosecrans of the House and Hicks of the Senate, an act relating to schools.
President Rosecrans, you're recognized to explain your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe there's an amendment.
Clerk will read.
Mr. Speaker, I move to amend House Bill 1007, page 8, Section 2, lines 23, by restoring the stricken word and on page 9, Section 2, lines 10 through 13, by deleting all the underlined language beginning with the word semicolon and through statewide. Amendment submitted by Rosecrans.
You're recognized to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this does, as I talked to the State Department of Education, there was a fiscal impact, and I have struck this. It was a reporting requirement, and we struck it. This is budget neutral at this point.
Do you yield?
Yes, yield for question.
President Hilbert, you're recognized for question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just looking at the fiscal impact, it says the amendment will have no additional impact. Does that mean it's taking out the fiscal impact of the original bill?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, there's no impact on this.
Thank you.
President Rosecrans moves unanimous consent. Amendment be adopted without objection and be ordered. Representative Rosecrans, you're recognized on the bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a much-needed bill that does a few things. Number one, it adds a consent and healthy relationships professional development for public school teachers. And number two, it adds an option for a consent and healthy relationships education program to be added if a Safe Schools Committee decides to do that. Move for adoption and open for questions.
Representative Rush, you're recognized for a question on the bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I appreciate you talking to me about this bill, and I appreciate some of the amendments. I noticed you took the word culture, or the portion that referenced to culture. I know you've worked quite a bit on this since last year, and I know last year this bill caused quite a bit of stir. I still have a couple of questions, and start with the part of the bill that refers to commercial consent. Can you tell me what that means?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes. If you don't mind, I have kind of these questions down here. I'm going to kind of search through them. I was ready for you. Definition of consent. Consenting and asking for consent are all about setting personal boundaries and respect, checking in if things aren't clear. Both parties must be in complete agreement, and consent is a law in Oklahoma.
You're recognized.
Yeah, I'm more interested in what commercial consent means. Not so. I know what consent means. I don't know where you come up with commercial consent for the schools.
Well, thank you for the question. I would say that is the program that we'll be using if a Safe Schools Committee decides to do that.
You're recognized.
And my next question is, why are you using the reference consent? Why would you not want to use the reference non-consent? Because that's where the problem is.
Well, thank you for the question. We chose consent because that's the whole idea of, no means no. I know where you're coming from with this, but with consent, we want to make sure that people cannot be coerced or anything else like this, because that's, if it's not affirmative, unambiguous, and voluntary agreement, then that's not consent, and you must have consent.
You're recognized.
So thus my point, would you agree that our problem is not consent? Our problem is understanding non-consent. Are we going to be teaching these young kids what and how to consent, or are we going to teaching them what it means when there is no consent?
Thank you for the question. I see where you're coming with this. The way I look at this, it's to make sure that our young people, our young adults, understand what to do if this ever comes up, so they can prevent themselves against sexual assault. This bill is to prevent sexual assault.
Representative Olson, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I appreciate your attention with this bill, and I know it's to prevent, as you said, sexual assault or rape, and I think we as a body are united in our absolute opposition to something like that. Few questions. First, who would teach this specifically?
Thank you for the question. The State Department of Education does have programs that are available. State Department of Health also has this. That's usually who they would go through. I think I know where you're kind of going through on this. If there's any kind of nonprofits or anything like that, it's up to the Safe Schools Committee to decide which direction they're going to go. It's all about local control.
You recognize.
So would that be the local teachers in the school?
Thank you for that question as well. Yes, let me tell you about the Safe Schools Committee. It's something I had to look up as well. And just give me a second here because I've got it all kind of lined out here for you. A Safe Schools Committee is made up of, yes, teachers, parents of enrolled students, could be even law enforcement, administrators, and whoever's on site for, this came from the idea to preventing bullying, honestly, Safe Schools Committee. So whoever's on site to the administrator that handles the bullying as well.
You recognize.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, the consent. I've looked at some of this material, and it seems to go in the direction that if the other one doesn't consent, you stop. But if the other one consents, everything is fine. We are speaking of sexual activity here. Is that correct?
We are speaking about preventing the sexual activity, but yes, I see what you're trying to say.
I'm going to give you one more follow-up and ask you to get back in the queue.
Oh, so we're speaking about single people in school. Would you agree that historically the sexual activity of two people that are not married is historically and biblically called fornication?
Thank you for the question. I really can't speak to that. The bill really doesn't cover that, but thank you.
Representative Worthen, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Representative, looking at the bill, I was curious what age groups. It doesn't provide any guidance on age groups in this bill.
I appreciate that question. This is up to the Safe Schools Committee to decide however they want to roll that out.
Representative Bush, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So would this bill provide an option so school districts could choose to implement the program or not? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Representative Brewer, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Representative, I appreciate this bill, and wouldn't you say that by starting with teaching about consent and healthy relationships, wouldn't that be empowering these students so that they know beforehand and they can see something unhealthy before they get into a bad situation? Wouldn't that be the goal of this bill?
Yes, 100%. That's one of the reasons why I ran it. Thank you.
Representative Hardin-Tommy, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, who determines what a healthy relationship is?
Well, thank you for the question, first of all. We try to define a healthy relationship, good communication skills. I mean, it's kind of ambiguous who defines it, but if you want an actual definition of what a healthy relationship should look like, excellent communication skills, emotional health, accountability and well-being in all relationships, and those are all part of healthy relationships, and this is kind of, I try to use these skills as well on the floor as well.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the language of this bill, basically the group at each school would be the ones that determine what a healthy relationship is. Is that correct?
Well, thank you for the question again. It's not really a determination that they're going to make. I mean, we try to put a kind of a definition in there, but it's really just kind of, a healthy relationship. So like I said, good communication skills, emotional health, those types of things to kind of teach these young people how to prevent sexual assault. Thank you for the question.
President Call, Chad, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So, Representative, they're already working on training and recognition of child abuse and neglect and child sexual abuse. So, if I'm hearing you right, you're trying to stop it from happening, educating them so that it doesn't happen in the first place, as opposed to responding to it, preventing it. Is that what you're saying?
Thank you for the question. I think you might be looking. See, there's two parts to this. Which part of the bill are you looking at?
Might recognize. Go ahead and answer that.
You absolutely are.
Let's see here. That is on page 3. It's existing law. I'm just clarifying here. So it says at a minimum of once in academic years, a program shall be offered which includes the following training. This is the professional development part.
Yes. So what that deals with is different than the other questions. This is the professional development part. We're simply adding in, right now we already, as a former teacher myself, I was trained on the recognition of child abuse and neglect. That's number 1. Number 2, recognition of child sexual abuse. I was trained on that as well. Proper reporting of suspected abuse, which thank God I was trained on that because it happened a lot. And then consent and healthy relationships education. So that's the 4th piece we're adding in for a professional development for teachers.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Switching gears now to the other part that you were referencing. So you said earlier the goal is to talk about, I can't remember the exact phrase, but I think another representative talked about basically, in essence, people engaged in sexual activity, and you were talking about not engaging in sexual activity. So I guess I don't understand the consent part of the not sexual activity. Can you help me out with that?
Yes, I can. Thanks for the question. And I can see this is kind of like a representative from Cordell's question as well. Had to keep thinking. So the idea of no means no is to teach that. And I know it says consent, which I think you're thinking is yes means yes. But it's not that way. It is teaching no means no, and when you're in that position to understand what coercion looks like, to understand what maybe being tricked into something looks like, just to have those conversations to be able to really prevent themselves from getting in bad situations.
I'll give you one more, and then you get back in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully this will be my last question, actually. So I know you talked about age-appropriate being left up to the Safe Schools Committee.
Right.
And I apologize. We went through this in committee, and I can't remember if we talked about this. Is there an opt-out? So if the Safe School Committee says we think it's appropriate for 4th graders, whatever it may be, and as a parent of a 4th grader, they say, we may think that's unwise, but they say, I don't want my kid to be part of that program because I've looked at the curriculum, and I don't think it's age appropriate for my kid because what I think is age appropriate and someone else thinks age appropriate can be different probably. So is there an opt-out for them that they can excuse their kid from that?
Well, thank you for the question. There's no opt-out language in here. Again, we're leaving it up to the local school to decide if they're going to do that, and that includes having opt-out language as well.
Representative, again, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, here on the version of the bill that I have on page 9, it says, if a school district implements a commercial consent and healthy relationships program, it shall use a program listed by the State Department of Health. Is there a non-commercial program that can be used by a local district? Is a local district able to develop their own program and implement it and fulfill the requirement of the law here?
Well, thank you for that question. It came out last year as well. That question came up last year as well. We're just trying to make sure that the State Department of Health has the final say on any kind of program that does come to our kids.
You're recognized.
So the school district isn't really deciding what is actually in the commercial program. They're having to just accept or not accept the commercial program that's provided by the State Department of Health.
Thank you for that question. No, not quite. I do believe down in Norman, Oklahoma, we have some groups like Bethesda that will come in, some nonprofits that will come in, and again, that's up to the Safe Schools Committee if they want to include that.
Representative Moore, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I was just wondering how much time of the teacher's professional development scheduling will this require?
I mean, thank you for the question. It's kind of hard to explain. We are required to have certain amounts of professional development, and I can tell you there's not like a blocked off part of it. Basically, it's like you choose this and you click on it and you try to get enough hours to for your required professional development.
You're recognized.
Thank you. And then how is this implemented into the school day, and about how much time will it require?
Just to clarify, the professional development piece or the other piece? Okay, it's going to be up to the Safe Schools Committee to talk to their representatives, to talk to the administrators to decide how best it works for their school. You're welcome.
Representative Fugate, you're recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, would it surprise you to know that I served multiple years on the Safe Schools Committees for 2 different schools?
Well, it kind of does. I'm glad to hear this, Andy. Sorry.
You're recognized.
And wouldn't you agree, Representative, that the best form of local control is the parents that are involved in those schools?
I would definitely agree with that.
Representative Rowe, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for clarification, I've read statistics that girls between the age of 16 and 19 are 4 times more likely to be raped, and that over 40% of all sexual assaults happen before age 18. Is that true?
Well, that is correct.
So,
You're recognized for follow-up.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this bill would help to combat some of those incidents. Is that true?
That's not only true, that's why I'm running the bill.
Representative Tadlock, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hadn't planned on asking any questions, but to go along with the representative from Enid earlier about opting out, so what you're saying is that the parent, they may opt out, but only if the school allows them to opt out. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, and yes, it would be up to that individual school.
You're recognized.
Safe Schools Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, so not to be redundant, so basically if I had in the school system, I would allow my daughter to go to that. I'm going to say that before I ask you something else. So what you are saying is, though, but if I didn't go along with exactly what the school wanted me to do, and I had a child that was in school there, and I didn't agree with what they wanted to, they could force me to send my child to that program.
No, that's not. Thank you for the question. No, I don't see it that way, because these Safe Schools Committees are made up of parents as well, and they inform the school board as well. Before something like this happens, they're going to have that conversation.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But Representative, what you're just saying, what you're saying, we would, if we came together and we all came to an agreement. But if we didn't come to agreement and everybody else did, they still could force my child to go to that class, go to that program, or could they not? Would I have the ability, if I didn't want to send my kid to that program and the safe school, they come up saying that, yeah, you have to go to that, do I have the option as a parent to opt out of that?
Parents always are listened to by the schools, we would hope. But I will tell you, as long as you talk to your Safe Schools Committee, especially the administrators in charge of the bullying or anything like that, then you could say, hey, listen, we need to add in an opt-out or even opt-in, however we need to look at it.
I'm going to give you one more follow-up and ask you to get back in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But what if they said no? What if they said no?
Representative Tadlock, at that point, I don't know. Again, this is up to the local schools to decide. It's not in the purview of this bill.
Representative Martinez, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the bill. My question is, you keep referring to the Safe School Committee. I'm just not really familiar with how does a person get on that committee? Is any parent entitled to be on the Safe School Committee? And just, I understand that there are parents on there, but if a parent just says, hey, I want to be part of this, are they allowed to be? Please tell me how somebody gets on that committee.
Thank you for the question. I had the same question whenever this bill was ran last year as well. To be honest with you, it's kind of hard to find the information about safe schools committees, but it is a matter of going to meetings, PTA meetings, and those types of things. Plus, in Norman, the administrator in charge of the bullying is the one that's going to kind of open it up and see who all wants to be a part of this.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So just to clarify, that it's not set in stone who and who can't be. It's kind of up to the administrator in each district to say, yes, you can be on the committee or you cannot be on the committee.
Well, thank you for the question. It's going to give me a chance to kind of explain to you exactly what these committees are. They're developed to decrease the rampant bullying, as I said before. They're made up of 7 members. So those must include teachers, parents of enrolled students, actual students, and a school official who participates in the investigation of bullying. And it may even include members of local law enforcement.
For follow-up? He waives. Representative Russ for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, would you believe that I am trying my best to try to work around not debating against this bill, and that, as you recall, last year we had all kinds of problems with the bill and it failed miserably, and would you believe that you had many of your people contact my office appalled that we did not pass this bill and couldn't believe that I raised some of the concerns that I had, and now would you believe that some of the very things that were an issue the last time are still not really addressed in this? Would you believe that I am shocked that we have nothing in this that has anything about abstinence, and it comes out rather than non-consent, it still has consent, and we're still, and I am completely supportive of what you're trying to do. I understand the teen pregnancy and rape and all that, and I'm highly concerned about that. Would you believe I'm just disappointed that we're taking this same approach again this year, trying to get where you wanted to be and was wanting to work with you. What happened?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, just a few things. That was kind of a long one. It did pass last year, 54 to 34. It was my first bill ever passed, and I did not get a standing ovation. No, I'm just kidding, I did. But and it went to the Senate, and we had bipartisan support. We truly did. I had A.J. Griffin as my Senate author. I think it was ready to be heard and ready to go. It's just honestly it ran out of time, and so that's the way I'm going to look at it. And now that I'm bringing it back, it's because I think it's so important. I mean, you haven't heard me get up here and even run any other bills, really, right? This is my only one. So,
Representative Stegall, you recognize for question on the bill.
I would have to talk to the creators of it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I can tell you've put a lot of time and thought into this, and I have appreciation for that. And if I can get a little bit of latitude from the speaker here, I can have just a couple of questions. Earlier, you made a statement that the State Department should have the final say on this education that we're presenting to the children in our schools. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You recognize for follow-up.
If they choose a commercial program.
Okay. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you also stated that we wanted to have more parental control. Is that correct?
Yes, that's why I'm leaving it up to local control.
I'm going to give you one more follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if we want to have our parents involved in the discussions and in the training, are we really saying when we give the state education department here the final say on this that they know, that the State Department knows more about how to have this discussion with our own kids than we do?
Thank you for that question. I kind of knew that question was going to come up, and I had some numbers that will kind of tell you that these conversations aren't happening as much as we thought they would be still. I mean, I come from a conservative Catholic home, and my parents taught me no means no, but those conversations don't necessarily happen so much anymore. So we're trying to help alleviate a problem that's kind of out of control, and young people especially, are being hurt by this on an everyday basis. Now, when it comes to, I see what you're saying about having the parents being the last word. I can't really find my numbers right here, but it's a full 81% of parents that didn't even know that this was an issue with their students. And if you know anything about me, I always come to bat for the young people and for my students as a former teacher. And this came from a young lady who was sexually assaulted, and it came to me to try to get something done with this. And this is just honestly a first step, and it needs to happen.
Members, I've closed the queue. Those in the queue will have one question, one follow-up going forward. Representative Van Kuren, you're recognized for one question, one follow-up on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, yeah, I'll later.
Representative.
Okay, well, I'll listen to you. Okay, yeah, it's fine. I'll go ahead and do it if that's what's going to kill it. Can we just do it right now? Hi. Okay.
Wait for you to finish. That's fine.
No, please.
Representative, my background is public education. 31 years as a biology teacher, and in those 31 years, I've taught HIV/AIDS education hundreds of times. And over that time, the Safe School Committee would meet and put together these programs. Would it surprise you that during that time that hundreds of students opted out, and those students were given optional assignments? Some of them could, and some of them could not apply to AIDS, HIV education. Would that surprise you?
So, just clarify the question. You're talking there was an opt-out for the HIV/AIDS. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. No, it wouldn't surprise me. I remember back when I was a teacher, we had some of those types of things as well. Members, I'd be willing to lay this over to no? Okay. I can do an amendment right now. Okay. No, I'm going to keep it.
Okay. Representative Van Kuren for one follow-up question.
Okay, and all those times that students have been given optional activities, I felt like that was a positive. The parents were able to make that decision for those children. The information wasn't forced on them. They were given the opportunity to do an alternative assignment, and I think it was a positive thing. So I've heard you say this is optional, that parents are given that as an option, and they can do other. I've never seen a kid be forced to sit in on an HIV/AIDS education. So would that be something that you feel like would continue?
Oh, yes. I think that conversation definitely can continue.
Representative Munson, you're recognized for a question on the bill. Representative Munson, you're recognized for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted an entire audience to hear my question.
You're not going to get it, so ask your question.
All right. There are a couple questions about healthy relationships, Representative, and I thought I'd help clarify the definition of healthy relationship. Wouldn't you agree that healthy relationships include mutual respect, trust, honesty, support, fairness, treating each other with fairness? Wouldn't you agree?
I would definitely agree with that.
You get one follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When you say that those qualities of a healthy relationship should be upheld in professional relationships, friendships at school, something that children should learn in school and then take on into their adulthood?
Oh, yes, I definitely agree with that. Thank you.
Representative Sterling. He waves. Representative Hilbert for one question, one follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I remember voting on this last year. I'm just curious, what changes, if any, specifically were made from the bill last year to this year?
Thank you for the question. Last year, we were made to, throughout the whole entire bill, omit shells versus mays, but there was really no reason to do that because this was already an option. Do you see what I'm saying? That was the main difference.
You're recognized for follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And then my follow-up's really unrelated. I noticed there's an emergency on the bill, but last year the bill passed with less than 68 votes. So should that happen again this year, and this have a November 1st date, would that mean this school year it would still be started regardless of whether the emergency passes or not?
I am not quite sure.
Representative Caldwell-Chad, you're recognized for one question and one follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I want to thank you for taking all these questions. You're doing a good job, and I certainly appreciate where you're coming from on that. To follow up on the representative from, I believe, Audubell, and his talk about, his conversations about opt-outs, and I think the representative from, I'm going to say Del City,
yes.
Who's not there, talked about local control and the best forms of local control. And so I would argue the best form of local control is the individual parent. No one knows my kids better than myself and my wife. So you've said that if the Safe School Committee wants to, they can do an opt-out. But obviously the flip side of that coin is if they don't want to do an opt-out, they don't have to. So why not just in the bill require there to be an opt-out for the parent?
Thank you for the question. I think I know where this kind of went off the rails. Parents can opt out of anything at all times.
You're recognized for one follow-up.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure I would agree with that, but I guess let's just say that I do agree with you. Obviously, as you can tell, there are some folks over here that have some very serious concerns, not at all with the concept, very supportive of the concept and everything. I mean, let's be real clear. No one's for unhealthy relationships. No one's for sexual assault and abuse and things like that. I mean, I think we all agree on that. So since there's a lot of concern on that, again, I'm just going to say, even if you're saying it's a guaranteed right anyway, why not just explicitly say it just to alleviate any concerns?
Well, thank you for that question. Again, since parents can opt out of anything, I do think that alleviates the problem.
Representative Rowe is recognized. She waves. Representative Russ, you're recognized for one question, one follow-up.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Representative, your language says if a school district implements a commercial consent program, I can't hardly make myself use those words, commercial consent program, it shall use a program listed by the State Department of Health. Representative, I'm just curious if you know this or not, but did you know that in order to have a health department in your county, that health department has to agree to give birth control to minors without the knowledge or consent or information to the parent? If that's the truth, do I really trust them to create this commercial consent program for my 12 or 13-year-old child?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think you're kind of talking about if you trust it. And you're talking about county health departments. And this is just making sure that if a commercial consent program is used, that it goes through the health department. And the reason why, if you want to know, is so it can be medically accurate and make sure that it follows those guidelines.
You're recognized for one follow-up.
So, since this is my one follow-up, I'm going to try to say this as careful as I can. And Representative, I hope the members realize that just because we have concerns about how you want to implement and approach your cause certainly does not, again, I emphasize, does not mean that we don't care just as much as you do about our teenagers and the relationships and so forth. And based on that, would you agree with me that the healthiest relationship would be one that includes abstinence?
Well, I look at it this way. Again, I was raised in a Christian home, a very conservative Christian home. I know that may come as a surprise to you. But in a perfect world, I believe that yes, abstinence probably would be the answer. And I never got to the numbers because honestly, it was going to be part of my debate. We don't live in a perfect world, and we're trying to, again, help young adults from, we're trying to make sure that they can prevent sexual assault. That's the whole meaning behind the bill.
Representative Rosecrans moves the bill be advanced from general order. Without objection, the bill. Third reading of the bill.
House Bill 1007 by Rosecrans of the House and Hicks of the Senate, an act relating to schools.
House will stand at ease.
I move to lay this bill over.
Mr. Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please recognize Representative Rosencrantz to present House Bill 1007.
Representative Rosecrans, you're recognized. Clerk will read. This was laid over, so we'll go back to the author. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is an amendment on the bill. Untimely filed amendment, and we need to...
Be at ease for a moment. Representative Rosecrans, do you have a motion? Representative Virgin, do you have a motion? You're recognized for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to rescind third reading of the bill.
Motion's been made to rescind third reading of the bill without objection. That'll be the order. Back to the bill. Representative Virgin, motion. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to suspend House Rule 8.6 for the purpose of offering an untimely filed main floor amendment.
It's a proper motion. Clerk, activate the machine for a vote on the motion to suspend the rules. Takes 2/3 vote. Declare the vote.
77 aye, 5 nay.
Having received 2/3 vote of the constituted body, I declare the motion to have passed. Back to you. You have the floor. Representative Virgin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I apologize. I just forwarded you the email with the language of the amendment, but it's a simple amendment. It just makes it clear that parents have the right to opt out of this education if they so choose. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move adoption and yield for questions.
Questions on the amendment. Members, questions on the amendment. Representative Rush, you're recognized for question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Stand by for a moment. We want to read the amendment. Clerk will read the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I move to amend House Bill 1007, page 9, section 2, lines 13 and a half by adding a new section E to read as follows. A parent or legal guardian of a child may refuse to allow the child to attend a healthy relationship education program created pursuant to the provision in this section and relettering subsequent section. Amendment submitted by a virgin.
Representative Rush, you're recognized for question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, based on the language I just heard read on this amendment, am I assuming that the member is refusing to add the part about abstinence into the program with the rest of the program?
Representative, thanks for the question, but that's not what this amendment deals with.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, for a motion.
State your motion.
I move to table the virgin amendment.
Proper motion. Motion's been made to table the amendment. Clerk will activate the machine for a motion to table the amendment. Declare the vote.
25 aye, 56 nay.
Members, the motion to table fails. Representative Rush, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to serve notice at some future date. I would like to reconsider the vote whereby this amendment failed.
Sorry, Representative, that only applies to bills, not to motions. Back on the amendment. Back on the amendment. Representative Robert Shaw, do you have a motion or a question on the amendment? Questions on the amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question. I have actually a question for the chair. Right now, are the rules still suspended for untimely filed amendments?
For that particular unfiled amendment. So we have that amendment up at this particular point.
Can an amendment be made to the amendment?
You'd have to suspend the rules to make, and we don't have the amendment, so you'd have to suspend the rules to do that.
I do have a question on the amendment.
You're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you be opening to striking title on this bill?
This is on the amendment. There's no striking of the title, so we're talking about questions on the amendment right now. Any other questions on the amendment? Representative Caldwell, Chad, you're recognized for a question on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I just want to make sure I'm reading your amendment here, so give me 1 second. But I'm assuming that this is just because it was done quickly, but the name of the education program that you're talking about it's a consent and healthy relationship education program. You just titled it a healthy relationship education program. Is that a typo? You meant it to cover all of the representative's bill or just that one part?
You want to respond?
Thank you. This was an amendment that was drafted quickly, so if we need to change that to make it clear, we can do that in the Senate. But the intent is to make sure that parents can opt out of the entire program.
Questions on the amendment? Seeing none, Representative Virgin moves that the amendment be approved without acclamation, without objection. That'll be the order. Back on the bill. Representative Rosecrans, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're just picking up this bill, which is House Bill 1007. It's also Lauren's Law. It's named after a young lady who came to me who was sexually assaulted, and she was incapacitated, and she came to me with that issue, and it led me to believe that we're not doing enough, and so that's why I've run this bill and moved to adopt and open for questions.
Questions on the bill. Representative Moore, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this is a commercial product that we're buying to implement. Is this a commercial product? A packaged product that we're going to be offering?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question?
Would you're recognized to repeat your question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So this professional development program, it was described as a commercial program or commercial product. Is it prepackaged so that everybody then has the same professional development program to offer to their teachers in each and every school?
So you're talking about the first part. Yeah, right. This does two parts. You're correct. To be honest with you, the program that will be decided is going to be decided with their committees as well, which is made up of something very similar to the Safe Schools Committee.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
So does it have a cost to it?
Thank you for the question. No.
Yeah, thank you.
Representative Rush, you have a question on the bill. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, did you send me an email that said that you had amended the bill and took the culture language out of this bill?
Thank you for the question, Representative. At one point, I did do an untimely filed amendment. I tried to follow up with each and every person that I decided not to strike that, and I do apologize if I wasn't able to get to everybody.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
So did you intend not to disclose that to me earlier?
Thank you for the question. No, I meant to disclose it to you and anybody else who I had the conversation with, and I do apologize.
Representative Hill, do you recognize for a question on the bill?
Representative, as you know, we've had long discussions over this one. My concern, of course, coming from some of the language, and just for clarity of this House, can you explain to us when we use the term culture, which seems to be the largest concern here this evening, can you express what that term is?
Thank you for the question, Representative. Yes, I'm a history teacher. I taught culture. And culture means diversity. Culture is our background. Culture is who we are. It's respecting that fact. That's culture, and that's the best definition I have for it.
For a follow-up? Representative, there's still some questions. Representative Caldwell. Chad, you're recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, thank you so much for putting that amendment on there. I very much appreciate that. We talked about this a little bit, but does a parent get to see the curriculum before it's they have a chance to review it? I mean, otherwise I get the fact we now get to opt out, so that's a definite improvement. Again, thank you. But they're kind of opting out on a position of ignorance if they don't get to see what the curriculum is. So will they get a chance to review that?
Well, in this particular bill, it's not going to mention that. We have added the parent opt-out, but I do imagine that they're going to be able to look at whatever it is. Whenever I was teaching, I remember anything that I had to give out, we had to give out a little summary of what it was.
Representative Roberts, Sean, for question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you be open to striking title on the bill since you're going to work on it and make changes in the Senate anyway?
Thank you for the question, but no.
Representative Russ, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Representative, would you agree that we spoke just a few minutes ago and I asked you and pleaded with you to add abstinence into your part of that curriculum? And can you tell me, do you not subscribe to or prescribe to or believe in abstinence as part of a good program? Or I asked the member earlier on the amendment, but why would you not want to add that in there?
Thank you for the question. This deals with consent and healthy relationships. It's not sex education. And I've tried to make that as clear as possible. And so abstinence doesn't really even enter into that conversation.
For follow-up, you're recognized.
So what are you going to be teaching consent about?
Thank you for the question. It's not going to be me teaching. It's going to be honestly, it will be a program that now will have multiple protections. Parents will have the opt-out choice. It's got to be through the Department of Health to make sure it's medically accurate, and I think that's what we're looking at.
Representative Russ, give you one follow-up.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. You just said that this is not going to have any reference to sex education. So are you not going to reference anything about sex in the consent portion of this?
Well, when it comes to consent, we're talking about knowing when to say no. We're talking about knowing if you seek coercion. We're talking about just having a healthy relationship to make sure you understand that you're not going into any areas you're not supposed to go into. It's a consent, making sure that it's okay to do.
Members, I've closed the queue for questions. We've been asking questions on this for over an hour, including the previous time, so we're going to close the queue on questioning. We have a few people in the queue at this particular time, and we'll finish with those. One question up to one follow-up. Representative Branham, you're recognized for a question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, would you believe that when we're talking about domestic violence, whether in teen dating relationships or in adult dating relationships, that actually the number one form of abuse is financial abuse?
I'd believe that.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
And then would you also believe that consent and teaching what consent is also falls into that form of abuse, and that both teens and adults alike would need to know what consent looks like both in that sphere and in any other sphere?
I completely agree.
Representative Hilbert, you're recognized for question and up to one follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I think everyone in here agrees the intent is pure here, and I believe, I'll have to go back and double check, but I believe I supported this last year. But my question, and then I'll have a follow-up, is do you agree with the good leader from Norman that changes will be made in the Senate?
Thank you for the question. There was a typo in the parent opt-out part. Well, just they didn't add the consent, the actual program. We will definitely be making changes.
Representative Hilbert for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a follow-up to the previous question, if you're committing to us now that you will make changes in the Senate, then why are you opposed to striking title? That way we know for a fact that it's coming back.
Well, and I understand. Thank you for the question. I understand your concern. Again, it was on the untimely filed amendment. It was done pretty quickly, and we're going to make sure and fix it for you.
Representative Randleman, you're recognized for question and one follow-up, up to one follow-up. You don't have to ask a follow-up if you don't want to.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Where'd he go?
Hi. Previously, we had conversations about striking the word culture because there was some confusion with that. And then it was put back in it again. Can you explain why?
Thank you for the question. I looked at it as, first of all, I went and talked to each and every member, at least I tried to, in this body. And that particular word was causing some problems. I guess it was ambiguous. There wasn't a good definition, and that's probably my fault, and I would do a better job next time if there ever comes up to where I have to define a word. But I think there was just some questions on that, and it was something that I didn't want to change because, again, culture, inclusivity is important to me, and that's what culture is. It's us. It's our background.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
That was some concern for us and everything, and that was one of my concerns because I even co-authored, but I'm not comfortable with that. So would you consider taking it back out or not?
Was your question, would I consider striking culture?
Yes.
At this particular time, I'm going to leave the bill the way it is. Thank you.
Representative Albright, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I wanted to address a previous question that the representative from District 55 asked a few minutes ago about how do you teach about consent without talking about sex? And would you believe that I teach my young children?
Members, please suspend for a moment. Members, I know it's getting late. Please be seated or take your conversations outside. It's getting hard to hear. House come to order. Representative Albright, you're recognized to finish your question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you believe that I'm able to teach my young children, I taught my son as young as 4, about consent without mentioning sex by putting it in other terms? For example, talking about tickling. I can tickle you, and when you say stop, I have to stop because that's what consent is. Would you believe that?
I would believe that.
Thank you.
Representative Martinez, you're recognized for question on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I sincerely appreciate what you're trying to do here. I really do think that this is an issue and it's something you're working on. Yes. Now, I'm a little bothered. Would you agree that you approached me and said you knew I had a problem with the culture and I had a constituent that was having some issues with that and you were going to take it out of the bill? Did you approach me about that?
Again, and I do apologize. I had marked out everybody who had an issue with that as I was whipping this. I really was trying to make sure I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. And I do apologize. I wasn't able to get to you to tell you that I really wasn't trying to be sneaky or anything. I made it to very many members, and I do apologize I didn't make it to you on that.
For a follow-up, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. So the other area that I still have some heartburn about is, we talk about the Safer Classrooms Committee, and we kind of talked about this earlier, the makeup of the committee, and that's fine. What I'm concerned about is if you have an administrator that's kind of controlling who can be on that committee and who can't, probably 99.9% of the times it's going to be done in a fair way. I'm worried about that one time or the few times that any dissenting voice or somebody who disagrees with the group is going to be alienated and not allowed on the group. So that's a big concern for me, just because seems like a real possibility. Do you agree that that could potentially happen?
Well, thank you for the question, and I understand your concern, but since I really can't be there, I really wouldn't agree with that because it's really, again, not in the bill. Thank you.
Members, that completes questioning. Representative Rosecrans moves that the bill be advanced from general order. Without objection, that will be the order. Third reading of the bill.
House Bill 1007 by Rosecrans of the House and Hicks of the Senate, an act relating to schools.
Representative Rosecrans moves final passage of the bill. Will there be debate? There is debate. Members, if you're wishing to debate in favor, please press your green button. If you'd like to debate against the bill, press your red button. Members, the chair is preparing to close the queue on the debate. Please get in queue. Close the queue. Stand by for a moment, be at ease as we prepare for debate. Does anyone want to yield on the speaking in favor? Anyone want to yield on that side? Representative Bell, who do you yield to? You don't want to debate. You waive your debate? Okay. Bell waives her debate. Anyone else wishing to yield on that side? You're waiving your debate? Do you want to waive? Munson waives. Anyone else? Okay, members. Representative Branham, you're recognized for 6 minutes speaking in favor of the measure. Members, House come to order. Prepare for debate. Take your conversations outside.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the time's been done before you even recognized her to give a Representative Branham to give a debate.
Alan, reset our time.
We'll reset the time. Your point's well taken.
Probably not.
Stand by, please. Members, House come to order. Please be seated. Take your conversations outside. Members, House come to order. Representative Branham, you have 6 minutes speaking in favor of the measure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't take much time because I know we're all tired and we all want to go home, but as someone who's worked with sexual assault survivors, domestic violence survivors, sexual harassment survivors, and just harassment survivors in general, I'm very disappointed at the tone that we're setting in this room right now, and especially in front of the young woman that this bill is named after, which is in the gallery watching our proceedings. Consent is something that needs to be taught regardless of whether we're talking about sexual activity, regardless of what sphere we're talking about. Consent has to do with, do I want something done to me, yes or no? And apparently from the rates of sexual assault that we have in this state, which are highest in the country in many aspects, we don't get that. So being able to teach our children what consent means and helping them to understand that, whether that means that you don't want a hug, or whether that means that you don't want someone to sit that close to you, or whether that means an actual relationship of a romantic type, we need to make sure we're sending that message. Consent is a word that's used in college, on college campuses. Anyone in this room who has children who's attended college, they have all had to take lessons over consent, because again, we have issues with sexual assault on college campuses. So if we're not starting to teach our children about consent and what that means, then we're going to continue to have that happen. On the topic of culture, Native women have the highest rate of domestic violence and sexual assault. And guess what? I bet that goes back to people not understanding consent. And in addition to that, many other cultures, whether that be interracial couples or people of other heritage, ethnicities, religions, everyone universally has issues with consent, which is why we continue to have these problems over and over again. So I would love for us to be able to have those conversations with children, young and old, about what it means to say it's okay or not okay for someone to do something to them, regardless of what nature that has to do with. So I would love to ask you, Speaker, not to vote for this bill. In addition to the rest of the members in the room, I yield to vote for this bill. That was a slip. Please vote for this bill so that we can begin teaching that lesson to our children and stop having all of these sexual assault, domestic violence issues happening later in life. And I yield the rest of my time to Representative Rosecrans.
Representative Rosecrans, you now have 9 minutes and 7 seconds. Representative Nichols, you're recognized to speak for 6 minutes in favor of the measure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were some things about the question and debate today. I think there's some great questions. I think the author of this bill even tried to do what he could to meet folks halfway. But there were a couple things that that stuck out to me. And the things that this bill is not about seems like to be the thing we talked about the most. Now, if we were to take my checking account, which doesn't have a ton of money in it, and you were going to make a bet with me, Mr. Speaker, and the bet was plus or minus the number of people who are serving in this House who have had sex outside of marriage, I had to go plus or minus on that deal, all my money in the bank, I'm going to say that most of us in here had sex outside of marriage at some point in our life, right? I'm going to also guess that most people in here didn't learn about how to do it in a consent class, because that's not where you learn about that kind of stuff. This is a simple bill that's going to teach kids how to have healthy relationships and prevent the things that we run bills on all the time to punish people for, and rightfully so. And it's really interesting to me, and I think those of us who are men on this floor should be the biggest proponents of something like this. Because one thing we don't live with is the kind of fear that's in the hearts of some of the people that this is here to prevent them from going through things they shouldn't have to go through. And so I hope that instead of trying to read between the lines and figure out what this bill says, or try to contort it to fit some fear that you have about what this could be or whatever, don't worry about the fear, because the fear is not there. This is about making sure that kids are protected in their relationships. I don't fear, as a father, what my kid learns from structured curriculum. I fear what he learns from all the other places that he can get information. All those things that that I won't necessarily consent to, that I can opt out of. And so all this is going to do is make sure that kids like mine, young people like the young lady that's named for, hopefully don't find themselves in very tragic situations. We talk about local control quite a bit, and even before we put the parental consent provision in, there are school boards that are elected at the local level that are going to make decisions about this, see if it's going to go into a school. There are PTAs, ones like the ones I sat on at my kids' school, that'll be thinking and trying to figure out if this is right for kids. So all there is left for us to do is do what we can to protect young people in their relationships and in their lives. And this right here is a way to prevent bad things from happening. It's also really interesting to me because it brings up, because I heard a number of times, I see what you're trying to do here, Representative, and I agree with you. And so if you agree with them, don't play into the fears of things that aren't there, right? Because when it comes to healthy relationships, or even when it comes to even more controversial issues, in a lot of ways we all have the same goals. Maybe we think about them differently. Maybe the pathway is different. But if you want to protect young people, if you want to get them the education that they need to protect themselves, then vote yes. Because I know everybody wants to do that here. I don't necessarily think a no vote means you don't care about that, but a no vote is feeding into the same kind of fear that keeps education out of the hands of young people and gets them in bad situations like the young lady that this is named for. And so I hope this has been a spirited debate, and I know we all appreciate that's what we're here to do. That's part of our job, and so I respect that. But let's do the right thing today. Let's not feed into fear. Let's go ahead and protect young people and vote yes. I yield the rest of my time to Representative Rosecrans.
Representative Nichols yields the remainder of his time to Representative Rosecrans. You now have 10 minutes speaking in favor. That's the maximum amount of time. Representative Olson, you're recognized for 10 minutes against the measure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the great question before us here tonight is what is best for the children of Oklahoma? And I think that's what we all have on our heart. I really do. But we have different viewpoints on what exactly is best for the children of Oklahoma. I certainly, as I've stated before, as many members have stated, we agree with the intent of this bill, and that is to protect young people from rape, from sexual assault, and I absolutely agree with that. I have 5 daughters, and if you asked anybody who knew me, they would agree that I am extremely protective. So I agree with that. I'm all in on that. Really, I would prefer that family took care of this. But if family doesn't, I would that the local church would take care of this. But if for some reason that doesn't happen, and we decide that government schooling needs to be involved with it, it is critical that we do it right. And there are good parts of this bill, consent and healthy relationships, and I have looked at it. There are good aspects to it. No means no. No means no. But there are some things that are lacking. Another concern with this bill is that numerous of us were told that culture would be taken out, and it was evidently taken out and then put back in. That is of great concern, I believe, to many members. But you know, when you want to know about something, the best way to do it is to ask the designer. If I wanted to know about this sound system, the best way I would know about it is to ask whoever designed and put this thing together. Well, there's somebody that wrote a book that was the designer of mankind. We're concerned with consent. Consent for what? It's very clear. You pull it up on the internet. It is consent for sexual activity. But the designer has given us some counsel along this line. He said, "For this is the will of God, that you should abstain from fornication. He said, God has not called us to uncleanness. You know, the Lord cares for us and tells us what's good for us. Purity, chastity, and faithfulness are things that are good for us. Now, I understand that the approach advocated by this bill does do some good things. However, I believe anything less than purity, chastity, and faithfulness is not good enough for my children or for our children here in the state of Oklahoma. If you care about the children of Oklahoma, I urge you to vote against this bill. Thank you for your attention. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
Representative Rosecrans, you have 10 minutes speaking in favor of the measure.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I've got a lot to say about this, but I'm going to stick with what I've got going on here. The idea to champion House Bill 1007, it came to me from when a student, Lauren Atkins, a high school student at the time, she came to me to share her story. She was sexually assaulted while she was incapacitated by a guy who later admitted it, but also admitted that he had no idea that consent was even a thing. House Bill 1007 is quite literally Lauren's Law. This led me to investigate to figure out how common this is and what I can do to help lessen it. Here are a few numbers that I have discovered. 1.5 million high school students experience dating violence every year. 1 out of 3 adolescents in the U.S. is a victim of physical, sexual, verbal, and emotional abuse. Only 33% of those in violent relationships even tell anybody about it. A full 50% of all youth who have experienced dating violence, they attempt suicide, compared to 12% of those in non-abusive relationships. 44% of sexual assaults occur before age 18. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually assaulted before they turn 18. 1 out of 13 high schoolers have recently experienced physical dating violence. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, young adults age 18 to 34 are less likely to understand consent than older adults, which many of us are. This is a huge problem that affects many, some of whom who are in attendance, and it demands our immediate attention. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 1007 is about the prevention of sexual assault amongst our teens and young adults. House Bill 1007 also is about helping our young adults to understand what a healthy relationship should be. According to the CDC, positive teen and peer relationships can help foster not only empathy, positive self-image and leadership skills, better interpersonal and communication skills, but they can also improve school performance. And we've been really trying to work hard on our schools to make them better. These skills will carry into adulthood to produce more engaged citizens, a more productive workforce, and safer communities, which we all fight for. House Bill 1007 is all about local control through each school site Safe Schools Committee. As I said before, each school site is actually required to have one of these committees. This committee was developed to help decrease rampant bullying within our schools, and they've recently taken on the mantle of trauma within our schools. They are made up of 7 members, which must include teachers, parents of enrolled students, actual students, and a school official who participates in the investigation of bullying, and may include members of law enforcement. I've also added a parent opt-out clause to further ensure local parent control. The Professional Development Potential Program, of which we speak in House Bill 1007, it's funding neutral, and it's available through the State Department of Education and the State Department of Health. So for no cost to the state, we can help prevent sexual assault amongst our young adults, which can benefit our state in every single way. Please allow me to go a little deeper into what this doesn't do. House Bill 1007 is not about teaching children sex ed. It is not an unfunded mandate. It is not a mandate of any kind for a school to implement it. It is not about pushing any kind of liberal or any other kind of agenda. To suggest this is the worst kind of fear-mongering. Mr. Speaker, I was raised in a conservative Catholic home. As we have heard before, my father was a Catholic priest, so for crying out loud, how much more conservative can I be? I was taught that no means no by my parents, but those conversations are not happening that much anymore. As a matter of fact, 81% of parents say that teen dating violence and sexual assault is a non-issue, or admit they don't even know if it's an issue at all. If we can teach even one young man that no means no and protect even one young woman from sexual assault, then this is what this bill will do, and this bill will be worth it.
Representative Rosecrans, please suspend for a moment. Members, please be seated. It's getting loud in here. Representative Rosecrans, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to culture, the word we're banding about, we're talking about meeting a child where they are. They may come from a violent culture. As a former teacher, I saw violence. I taught in Oklahoma City public schools. I taught on the south side. I taught on the northeast side. These kids were a product of a violent culture. I also noticed how we have a certain culture here in this chamber, as you just perfectly exhibited when you asked the members to quiet down. It's part of the culture. We have a culture. We actually teach consent here too. There are certain things we can and cannot do, like taking videos on the floor. Can't do it. And we had to learn about it before we knew how to follow it. Kids need to know that they have the power to say no, to not consent. That's what this bill attempts to do. Our new governor talks about top 10 a lot. Currently, Oklahoma ranks in the top 10 for relationship and sexual violence. Please join me in passing a bill that can help us flip that. A bill that can help us to be top 10 in the least amount of occurrences of sexual assault. Please join me in passing a bill that can do so much good for our children who are the true future of our great state. I'll end with a quote from a recently graduated local Norman high schooler. Her name's Tavana Farzana, who helps us to understand the issue from the point of view of a student. That's who I'm fighting for. The quote is, a lot of students in high school specifically, they're not aware when they're in an emotionally abusive relationship or they are being sexually abused in a relationship. They aren't aware of what a healthy relationship looks like. Mr. Speaker, members, please join me, a teacher, a parent, and yes, I'm a Christian, who will always fight for better mental, emotional, and physical health for the young folk in our state. It's why I ran for office. In voting yes on Lauren's Law, House Bill 1007.
Members, you've heard the debate. Question before the House is shall the bill pass. Clerk will activate the machine. Sergeant National call in the halls. Roll calls in progress. Declare the vote.
39 aye, 56 nay.
Having failed to receive a majority vote of those elected to constitute the House, I declare the bill to have failed. Mr. Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please recognize Representative Rosecrans.
Representative Rosecrans, you're recognized for what purpose?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At a future date, I'd like to reconsider the vote on whereby House Bill 1007 failed.
The Journal will so note. Representative Roberts, for what purpose?
Point of order.
What states your point?
It's been the custom of the House, and it may be in the rules, but I don't have it off the top of my head, that if the Speaker calls on the floor leader,
You'll need to cite the rule. You'll need to find the rule. If you've got a rule, check the rule, and then we'll pause for a moment for you to look up the rule. Representative Russ, for what purpose? State your point. Point of order. What's your point?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to Rule 9.2, it's improper for a member to impugn other members on the floor. I don't take personal offense to what Representative Nichols said, but his implication that most of the men on this floor had sex before marriage leaves it questionable as to whether any or all of the members had sex before marriage, and therefore implies that abstinence is old-fashioned and out of date.
So what's your point? What I think you made it.
Therefore leaves the wrong impression of all the members in this House that are male members as to whether that's true or not.
Thank you for your point. Members, please be seated. Mr. Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is now time for announcements and introductions.
Members, time for announcements or introductions.